I
Now,
appreciate
when
that.
did you decide that you were inclined to the languages? So was this before or after you came to the master's seminary and started taking some theological courses?
Yeah, so I wanted to learn the languages before I went to seminary, and that was one of the reasons for going overseas to go to seminary. But I tried reading Mounce's second edition and doing the exercises on my own, and found that was just really hard. So during my
Hmm.
college, so I did my undergraduate degree, and they had a fast track adult program, so I did that in a short period of time, and I did Greek as part of that. But then when I was in seminary and we were doing Greek exegesis classes, and particularly as I went in to do the entrance exam to test out of beginning Greek, because I'd already done it. I don't know why I had to do that. But anyway, I did. I had to translate anything from First John. I was like, well, I'm just going to learn the vocabulary for First John, and that way, at least that part of the challenge is out of the way. And then as I
Hmm.
went through further exegetical classes, I just kept doing that process of learning new books, verse by verse, word by word kind of thing, starting with the words I already knew, but just building on those. And as I went through, I did 7 semesters of Greek in seminary, and as I went through, that's kind of the method I used. And I came out of seminary, and I thought I could probably turn the system that I've developed into a product and sell it while I'm doing my PhD, and that will
Hmm.
maybe help support us. And then I discovered memberships, and so it kind of turned into a membership and whatnot. So it was really when I was in that second, third year of seminary. And again, it wasn't like I'm amazing at languages. There are other guys. There's 5 of us got together and we called ourselves the Greek geeks.
Hmm.
But
Hmm.
we sort of just worked hard together on Greek. And some of those guys were much sharper than me. But at the end of the day, it was that methodology and applying that methodology consistently that actually helped me particularly get through those semesters and then turn that into a system that can be reproduced and reused. And now we've got people all around the world following it and getting similar
That's so
results.
cool.
So yeah,
Yeah,
it's
that's so
great.
cool. I remember when I was at Malone, taking Greek, the very first class that I ever took in Greek, the professor, Dr. Watson, who's a great Bible researcher, one of the world's foremost scholars on Jude and Second Peter. And he wrote just the alphabet on the board, and I was enchanted by it. I
Mm,
loved Greek from the moment I saw the first word. In fact, I think I knew I was going to love it before class even started because the pastor had used the word agape or something like that. And I was just like, man, I would give me more agape.
yeah,
I want to know this. And so Greek
yeah.
was one of my all-time favorite classes. Now, I'm not as technically proficient as you are for sure. In fact, taking Greek is when I learned English. A lot of people say, you take
Yes,
Greek and you learn how English works. It's like, oh, yeah.
exactly. Yeah.
But a lot of that is kind of, I'm probably past my prime in terms of understanding the language on a technical level, but I still read my Greek New Testament all the time.
Mm,
In fact, there is a great little article by J. Gresham Machen in his selected shorter writings on reading your New Testament daily.
mm,
And if you have not read that before, you would personally love this little article that he's
mm,
written. But he's writing for pastors basically, and he says, you've got to keep reading your Greek New Testament every single day, even on the Lord's Day. It's
mm,
part of your devotions to read from the Greek New Testament. And for
mm.
the most part, I've tried to keep that advice.
Yeah.
So my process right now is that I have my Greek New Testament, and I have a pencil, and I have a little ruler, and I have a little pen. And as I'm working through any given book, like right now I'm on Mark chapter 11, I take my little pen and I bold the verse numbers as I go through each verse, translating it. And then whenever I come to a word that I don't know, I take my little ruler and I make a nice even line and I give myself a marginal gloss of the meaning of the word. And that's the way I just continue to read just a little
Mm,
bit at a time. Sometimes it's a whole page, sometimes it's a paragraph. Probably most of the time, I'd say a paragraph is about what I do. And then, of course, I use Greek for my sermon building as well, just thinking through the text at a more critical level. But
mm.
that devotional Greek is what keeps the language alive
Yeah.
in my mind.
Yeah, I reckon I think that's critical because if you don't do that, you end up sort of thinking of and the way you use the language is very inorganic. It becomes an exercise in picking words and phrases, pulling them apart, looking at them through the lens of dictionaries, word studies, things like that, and with dependence on technical grammars. Whereas if you're actually reading the text for yourself, you're actually following the author's arguments. You know, you're actually seeing that he's putting together a thought, a concept here that he wants me as a reader to take away from this. What is that concept? And then how do the words shape that concept? And so you're actually thinking at an expositionary level, if you like, even as you read, and that gives you a much more organic feel for the language, a much more organic understanding of how the language contributes meaning to that piece of the text, and then how to actually convey the text back to your congregation as well. You're not in this world of trying to sort of break out in phrases and clauses and that kind of stuff. That part is sort of done in your mind before you start. Not to say that you shouldn't do block diagrams or anything like that, but you know, it really makes a big difference to the sermon preparation. So I think that's the way to go. And so let me just ask you a question with
Hmm.
regards to that. I assume you're not using a reader's edition, because otherwise you'd have the word at the bottom, right? Did you at any stage use a reader's edition? And at what stage did you transition away from that?
I do have some readers editions. They have not tended to be the ones that I prefer for the most part. I just like the text itself. So I have a kind of an older copy of it's the blue covered copy of the Byzantine text
Hmm.
is the one that I use. I have some of the other, I have every other one. I just
Hmm.
collect New Testaments, so I've got like all of them.
Yeah.
But I will consult an interlinear at times as well for those words that I just don't know or can't figure out by the
Mm.
context. So I'm not ashamed to use that. I try not to, though. I mean, the goal is to try to attain some kind of literacy
Mm.
and to not depend too much on programs and, like your Bible softwares and things
Yeah.
like that. There's some great ones out there. I just don't really use them myself.
Yeah.
So I kind of do the old school way of just forcing myself to read through it and then penciling in my glosses or translations in the margin. That just works a little bit better for me. But I do use an interlinear to find those words that I just can't figure out what
Right.
we're talking about.
Yeah.
And that's why I think reading through books of the Bible, even in Greek, even very slowly, it's just better than dropping down like a parachuter into a text randomly and trying. That just doesn't make sense. It's so
Mm.
hard.
Mm.
Let me put it this way. If you gave me a random Greek sentence from the New Testament, that would cause me a little bit of panic because I don't know what the context is. I don't know where this is. I'd hope it was from a gospel, and not like Hebrews or,
Yeah.
Luke's pretty hard to read too. But reading through context helps you because, first of all, you probably know the Bible pretty good in English. A lot of people
Exactly.
do.
Hmm.
And so, even if you come across a word that you've never heard of before, if you can't break it down by the root word, which is where I usually start, I just look for roots. But at least you kind of know the story. And so you
Mm.
know what should be coming up there. And
Mm.
so, a lot of the nouns, especially, they just kind of fill themselves in. But there are places where you get a lot of technical vocabulary that's isn't used all the time, and that's where, yeah, you might have to use a readers
Yeah.
or a interlinear or some kind of help online just to make sure you're tracking correctly.
So how did you get started? I mean, you went to seminary, you learned Greek at Malone.
Hmm.
How did you go from like first year Greek to being able to pick up a Greek New Testament and follow along? I mean, how good is your vocabulary? How'd you get it to that kind of level?
I would say, I'm probably just an average Greek reader, so I'm not the superstar out there that people should necessarily emulate. However, that one attribute that I mentioned earlier, the stick-to-itiveness, I had that, especially in college. And so whenever my professors would assign us a list of words or vocabulary or exercises to do, I did them all.
Mm.
And that's just part of maybe a little bit of obsessiveness of my
Mm,
personality that if
mm,
somebody tells me I have to do something, I literally do that thing.
yeah.
So vocabulary has never really been that hard for me,
Mhm,
because a lot of it just starts off with memorizing lists.
yeah.
But when I went to Ashland for my master's degree, I also had to take Greek again. So, but this time I was able to take some advanced classes. And we took this one class that was primarily focused not on vocabulary, but roots.
Mm,
And I think that class was really helpful to me because there we were not taught to memorize lists as much as to break words down
yeah.
by their root words. And so
Mm,
for the listener who's, not sure what I'm talking about, if you can just imagine Lego pieces of words that come together, you've got your endings, you've got your main and sometimes a suffix. And if you can learn like basically your paradigms of your endings, even if you don't have them memorized, a lot of them start to feel pretty formulaic after you go
mm,
for a while. And then you've got your prefixes. But if you learn a couple hundred root words, man, your vocabulary just expanded like tenfold
mm,
because there's so many words, even the hapax legomena that are only in the New Testament once, that could be reasonably figured out if you had done quite a bit of work in your root words. So that for
mm,
me was kind of like a breakthrough. But honestly, again, if there's like a contest of like 10 pastors who's the best, I'm like number 4 or 5. I'm not the
yeah.
best,
No,
but
but
I keep using it and I love it. And I
yeah.
find that it just elucidates my understanding of scripture. And I never, ever, ever get bored of the scriptures themselves. I just find it just
Mm.
relentlessly interesting.
And I think that, there's a couple of things I want to touch on there. First of all, that idea of touching on roots, I think is genius. It's not something that is normal. That is unusual, I think, in the world of learning Greek to focus on roots. But I think it's helpful. We focus on morphology, which has some focus, we explain what a root is, but we don't do as probably a good a job as we could of actually bringing out the roots and the base lexical meaning that comes with that. But that would be something that I think would probably be a helpful thing for us to add in the future. Because again, it does. I mean, as you start to learn the lists, you do start to see there's this repetition. The iso ending, for instance, it takes that same root, but then it adds a causative kind of idea to it. And there's a number of different things like that. So that's a really helpful way of doing it. Do you know who ran that class by any chance?
His name was Dr. Byron, and I don't know what became of him. I think he's still teaching at Ashland, but I could look up the book that we
Mm,
used if I think I still have it on my shelf over here
hmm
and maybe send you what that was. But
mm,
here's just an idea. This would be kind of cool. And I don't know if this would work for your program, but what if you took like the really rare words, right? So in every list of vocabulary, it's kind of like a pyramid, Down here's your words that are used 1,000 times, and then
mm,
as you get up to the top, you get your words that are used only once. Well, what if you took the top of that pyramid, the rare words, and then tried to build a root learning system just from those so you
mm,
could put those Lego pieces together. And that way, when the most common roots, and that way, when the reader, comes to these strange words that he or she is not familiar with, then it's like, okay, well, can I take this apart and
mm,
reasonably make a guess, at least a good guess of what this
yeah.
word might mean based on some of the roots here that I can observe.
Yeah, no, that's a great idea. Yeah. Yeah, I'd love to, just let me know if you can find that book. I have a couple like that, but I'd be keen to hear another one, so that'd be great.
I'm looking at your books in the background, but I don't know if I see it or
These are
not.
yeah, if it's any of these, actually, you know what? It's probably not any of these. The one that I'm thinking of is Robinson. I can't remember the name of the book. I remember the authors. I often remember just the authors, not the names of the book. But that's at home. So I've got a bunch of other books that are at home. These are really just largely for show, if anything.
Those are your showpieces, Daryl. Yeah, you
Yeah,
can you can admit that. I-
yeah,
I've got a few
yeah,
things that are just there to look good too.
yeah. But no, these are mostly just Greek. There's one or two church history or, about the church itself. Life in the Father's House, Wayne Mack is, how to be a good church member, so to speak.
Hmm.
Habits of the mind, intellectual life, those are really just about, academic thinking and that kind of stuff. So
That's
most of
cool.
them are just showpieces. Um,
Yeah, yeah.
yeah. So, going back to that comment you made just at the end there, that you never get sick of reading the scriptures. I think one of the reasons for that, I mean, that's kind of an indicator that you're a Christian, I think, in a lot of ways, because the scriptures feed your soul, right?
Hmm.
How would you, I mean, again, reading the New Testament, how do you read through the Old Testament as well? I assume you have an Old Testament reading plan as well as a New Testament reading plan. How much of the New Testament do you read each day? How much of the Old Testament do you read each day? How much of your Greek do you kind of incorporate with that? How does that balance work for you?
Well, one thing that's worked for me over the years, and I'll say something, it sounds like I'm bragging, but I'm just telling you the facts. Again, I started reading the Bible all the time when I was young. The last time that I did not read the Bible someday was, I think, 1997. So I'm
Wow.
on a pretty long streak of reading the Bible every single day now.
Mm,
And I remember that day because I was a college student working at a summer camp, and I had too busy of a day with 12 wild animals in my cabin that I was responsible for, and I didn't read the Bible that day, and it just stuck in my mind of like, well, I'm never going to let that happen again.
mm,
And so, Bible reading is just part of my everyday experience, and usually twice a day, usually morning and evening. So we'll start with that. But beside that, one thing that I do is I constantly vary the routine that I'm in. I change it up all the time. I challenge myself new ways and different ways. So, beginning in January of most years, typically I start my read through the Bible in a year program. And I've done it so many different ways, Daryl, just to keep it fresh.
mm,
Sometimes I start in Genesis and work my way straight through. Sometimes I have multiple tabs in my Bible and I'll read like from 5 different places a day. Sometimes I'll just read what I want to read and check them off on a list, but always something. And I'm just making that progress through. So as I begin to make my way through most of the scriptures, we get to the summertime or whatever. Then often I'll throw in other challenges to myself just to keep it fresh. And
mm,
there, maybe I'll work on my scripture memory note cards. I've got note cards that I've had from the time I was in college of Bible verses that I'm trying to memorize. I've read in the original languages in different ways. For instance, I had a long period where I was reading from the Septuagint just to do
mm,
Greek of the Old Testament. That was
mhm.
fun. Right now, I'm just progressing very slowly through the Greek New Testament again for I'm not sure how many times I've done it. It's not a ton, but because it takes a while, you know.
Yeah.
I'm also writing Hebrew right now, which is a different way of staying
Mm,
fresh in the original languages. My Hebrew is not nearly as good as my Greek by a long
same with me.
shot.
Yeah.
But what I do is I write out the Hebrew in hand, and then I write a translation or a gloss in pencil. So the
Mm,
Hebrew in pen, and then a translation in pencil. And that just keeps my mind working with the Hebrew because I just don't want to lose it. I feel like at age 48, you take too long off of anything when you're almost 50 years old, and it'll decline quick.
yeah.
It goes for running or lifting or whatever you're doing.
Mm,
I just try to stay current. And so I challenge myself to progress through the Bible in different ways.
mm, mm.
Sometimes I've done chronological read-throughs before. It's almost like every year I just pick something new.
Have you ever read
So,
through the Bible, or at least the New Testament, in the order the books were written?
yes, I did that. No, no,
They would start
no,
with
I haven't.
James.
I did the chronological, but I
Mm,
didn't do it in the order that they were written.
mm,
When I did through the Greek entire New Testament, I basically went in order of easiest to hardest.
yeah.
I had found a list online where
Yeah, there's a few of
somebody,
them. Yeah.
maybe it was
Dan
you, I
Wallace.
don't know, maybe it
Yeah,
might have been
Dan
you.
Wallace has one, Rob Plummer has one, I have one. Yeah, we're all different too.
Okay, yeah, it might have been yours actually.
Okay.
And I thought that was helpful because then it's like, okay, well, let's get some confidence here. Let's do First John and just
Mhm.
get get that confidence going. And then each book is a little harder. What did you have as the hardest book? Is it Hebrews?
No, actually, Acts, Luke and Acts,
Acts. Yeah,
mostly
yeah, Luke and
because
Acts.
you've got this huge variety of new words, particularly toward the end of Acts.
And I remember being very frustrated with myself when I was in Luke because I was telling myself, look, this is a synoptic gospel. I know a lot of the stories. Obviously, Matthew and
Mm,
Mark are very similar. And then I was just like, Luke was kicking my behind.
Yeah.
And I'm thinking like, I feel like I'm a failure, but you just keep pressing on, just keep forcing
Yeah.
yourself to do it, and it gets better.
And when you feel like that, it's often good to go back to one of those other easier books, even a Pauline epistle, and read that. And you're finding like, oh yeah, I can actually do this. It's
Yeah.
just this one book that's just, it is a challenge. That's why it's kind of later in my list because it's a challenging book to read. So you're not alone there. Yeah.
Revelation is really fun to read in
Oh
Greek
yeah.
because, for one, the vocabulary is really not that hard. I mean,
No.
it's a lot of very vivid stuff. You're talking about
Mm,
dragons and martyrs and, it's all these beautiful pictures and
hmm
colors and just vivid descriptions of action
mm,
sequences. And of course, all the glorious descriptions of Christ. It's very devotional. Then you've got
mm.
some of the prayers, some of the liturgical pieces. Like that's a
Yeah.
great place
I,
to
I
just
I agree.
enjoy the Greek.
I reckon that the book of Revelation is really kind of a misnomer in some ways. We think of it as the book of the end times, but I think it's far better to think of it as the book of the glories of Christ. And if you
Yeah,
read it that
definitely.
way, then it's actually quite enthralling, even if you
Yes.
can't figure out all of the details along the way, right?
Yeah, well, speaking of, biblical interpretation, I would consider myself to be an amillennialist, and I take an idealist interpretation of the book for the most part, which
Mm,
basically means that we do not push off everything just to the last of the last, but we think
mm,
that the book has abiding value for every generation of believers,
mm,
and that many of the themes are rather cyclical in the book of Revelation, so that you have, like, where's the judgment? Well, there's multiple judgments in the book of
mm,
Revelation. Where's the return of Christ? Well, you have multiple pictures of the return of Christ in the book of Revelation. Suffering, tribulation, all these things are like abiding themes that all believers need to be strengthened by. We
mm,
all need
mm.
this word from the Lord. So,
Yeah.
yeah, I find Revelation to be just a gorgeous book and thrilling to study.
Yeah, and I agree. And even though I am a dispensationalist, I still look at that book and it's really, whatever happens with the times and the seasons and all those kinds of things, it's really a book about how Christ takes up his rightful place to be worshipped by the whole universe and to be glorified in the Lord and the Father, right? So all of that is again, that's our heart, right? As Christians, regardless of what the view we have of redemptive history and end times and all those kinds of things, that's our heartbeat behind all of us is let's see Christ glorified. And that book is the book that crowns all of that in a sense. So it's a great
Yeah.
book. I agree. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Wonderful book to preach and to read and to memorize. A lot of great
Mm,
memory verses in there too.
mm. Well, I know you've got other things to do, and we're sort of getting close to the end of our time. One of the things I was kind of, and this has been a lot of fun actually. It's been great just to sort of get
Very
to know
fun.
you a little bit more and just to
Yeah.
talk and listen. I was kind of interested in your thoughts on your seminary training with Greek, particularly. What was some of the things? What was the most, and not necessarily with regards to Greek, but just like maybe throw some Greek in there somewhere. But what was the most useful part of your seminary training overall in terms of its preparation of you as a man?
Mm. Well, let me I'm not gonna try to resist being too negative here. My seminary experience was okay.
Hmm
I would not describe it as great. And one of the reasons for that is that I commuted quite a distance to go to seminary, and it took me about 6 or 7 years to finish my master's degree. And so a lot of that was kind of disjointed study as I was working really hard. I had to have a
hmm
job. We were having kids,
mm
we're trying to build a family. And so I wouldn't say that I had this time of concerted study like a lot of people do when they go off to seminary. And so, unfortunately, when class was over, I had to jet. I had to drive and I had to get back to work and I had little ones. So, I did not stop to smell the roses, to stay in the library, to ask my professors questions, to develop strong relationships and things like
mm
that. So, in some sense, because I just went where I could go, there's several things that I would say I lament about my seminary time. That notwithstanding, the best thing about seminary is that it teaches you how to learn. It teaches you how to become a learner on your
Yeah.
own. And I've always been the kind of person that is enchanted with learning. I love to study, to read. I love to take notes. I love to press myself. And seminary taught me how to read and to write in a way that really benefited me in the long run, especially if you're going to be a pastor.
Mm,
If you think that as a minister, you're going to be able to just kind of like delight people with your whimsical stories in the pulpit, that's not going to happen because you're probably not that clever and your people are going to be bored with the same stories if you try to
yeah.
tell them again and again.
Yeah.
So your only recourse is to come with fresh material every single week so that you're not boring and they're not bored. And the best way that I know of to have fresh material is to be an expository preacher that works
Mm,
through books of the Bible passage by passage, because then the text every week is an adventure in its own right. The first adventure is I got to figure out what this thing means. I have to get rid of my predispositions, what I think it means,
mm,
disabuse myself of some of the bad teaching maybe I've acquired over the long haul, find out what the text means. And then the second challenge is how do I get this thing into a homiletical form so that I can convey that information in the best way possible?
mm,
And so seminary taught me how to do that. It taught me the basic skills. It gave me the everyday carry tools that I need all the time to do the work of the ministry. But if I had to do it all over again, I probably would have chosen a different seminary and I probably would
mm.
have applied myself in different ways than I could
Yeah.
at the time.
I totally understand that. Because I was in New Zealand, I had to just say, well, if we're going to do this, we're going to do this. We ended up selling our house, using our equity in our house to live in the States for 4 years.
Wow.
And so we just devoted ourselves to that one task. So I actually started teaching computer science because I used to work for IT companies, Microsoft and whatnot. And so I started doing a little bit of adjunct teaching at the Masters
Hmm.
University as a computer science teacher, and just found that it was just too hard to switch from learning to teaching, and then the whole tech to to theology was hard as well. So I gave it up and just focused on getting through seminary and the quick as I could possibly, which I think was the right thing to do. But yeah, there's lots of people who I went to seminary with who are like you, spent 7 years going through an MDiv, and you do what you have to do, right? And we all
Got to
get
do it.
strained by different pressures and whatnot.
Yeah.
So yeah. So if you were what would be one thing, particularly with your Greek, now that you've sort of gone through, you've learnt more Greek, you've sort of developed your ability with it, what do you think is one thing that the seminary could have done to really help with that particular piece of your journey?
So there's one thing that I would say, and that is you have to let me start over. You cannot be an individual in the sense that if you're going to try to be this rugged individual that's going to do this on your own, that's going to be a rough go. One of the best advantages that I had is a little small group of study buddies that we had where we kind of kept each other accountable to the task. We were helping each other work through the exercises, constantly discussing the possibilities of interpretation. And so, of course, some people are going to learn better by themselves and other people are going to learn better in groups.
Mm,
But I thought facilitating these little study groups of two or three or four people together, holding each other accountable to the exercises was
mm,
really pretty helpful for me,
mm,
because it's kind of like math where you have this sneaking feeling that everybody gets it but you.
mm.
You know, if you've ever been in a math class, it's just a little bit too hard, like
Yeah,
trigonometry or calculus, and you're like
yeah.
looking at your students and you're thinking, "Man, I'll bet they get this, but I don't get it." And you feel sheepish, you feel ashamed of yourself, you feel like you're the one person who's behind. Well, probably that's not true. Probably
Mm,
everybody is struggling with the same things that you're struggling with. And so, at least for me, having somebody to help me through it, to talk through it, even out loud,
mm.
was very, very helpful. Because sometimes in Greek, you come up to a problem that your brain just can't work around.
Yeah.
You either need to talk to the professor or you need to talk to a buddy, and not being ashamed to ask a question is probably the
Mm.
best advice I would say.
Yeah, I agree. And I think one of the reasons people struggle a lot of the time is because they aren't willing to ask questions or talk about their problems, particularly with Greek. We see that. And so we try and facilitate conversation. We have office hours and you can chat with other members and join calls and all that kind of stuff. But if you
Yeah.
don't do that, you're going to be stuck with that problem until you actually do get outside of your shell. So I think that's really insightful.